Morning, everyone. Happy Friday to you all. It's a pleasure to join you all, even though it is remote, but I'm definitely thankful for this opportunity to discuss a topic that I find particularly very important and necessary in how we think about making knowledge accessible and improving inclusiveness within society through access to knowledge. I will title this Democratizing and Decolonizing Access to Knowledge. A prominent African man was born into American slavery nearly 2 centuries after the first enslaved Africans were brought in chains to the American soil. He would later write that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. He elaborated on the liberating properties of knowledge, particularly for those who are most marginalized, by saying that the great mass of slaveholders look upon education among the slaves as utterly subversive of the slave system. Within this quotation, the idea of knowledge having liberating qualities and powers is quite evident. This intuition is quite similar to that of Francis Bacon, who was very integral in the process of creating published knowledge and the scientific method. Francis Bacon would write that the sovereignty of man lieth hid in knowledge. He would compare that even the wealth of kings and royalty cannot necessarily accomplish what knowledge can do. Knowledge applied to anybody can have liberating effects. It can bring about sovereignty, a sense of liberty, sense of dignity. However, knowledge is not always equally accessible to many. And knowledge, when misapplied, can have a very damaging and harmful effect to individuals and to society. Knowledge asymmetries can be used to subjugate others and delay justice. The effects of restricted access to knowledge detrimentally impact those who are directly oppressed and perpetuate harmful societal biases. Centuries after the United Kingdom initiated the slave trade, the first African to publish a book against slavery, Otoba Kugawano, would acknowledge and demonstrate how the attitudes that are shaped by the lack of knowledge, the knowledge of others, can spread across society to create biases. He found that even within his society, it had already become, in less than a century, a dominant idea that the African was not entitled to any competent degree of knowledge or capable of making any moral decisions. Now, the fact that I'm speaking before you here today as an African is a testament that at least within this community, such attitudes have shifted and they're changing. But we need more of that. In order to prevent knowledge, when once acquired, from being misused, and instead to be used for emancipatory purposes and to assert one's dignity, we need to make this knowledge, make sure that it is open and that we address the issues around the creation and the production and the use of knowledge. Douglas writes in his autobiography, reflecting on the issues that prevented many like him, enslaved Africans, to access knowledge. He writes that the crime of teaching a slave to read was punishable with severe fines and imprisonment, and in some instances with death itself. End of quote. Now picture this: access to knowledge punishable by severe fines and sometimes death. The ability to share and publish knowledge also punished by severe fines and sometimes death. These sanctions resulted in the marginalized becoming further excluded from the knowledge ecosystem and from being able to participate in it. Without the ability to read or write, many enslaved were not able to fully participate in this ecosystem. And today, as science and knowledge has continued to progress, other institutions, other standards, other procedures within our own fields whose outcomes will still result in the marginalized being excluded from the knowledge ecosystem. The many people across the world still face obstacles and challenges that prevent them from accessing liberating knowledge, whether it's in medicine, biology, technology, or even vaccines. A prominent example that I saw in the past 2-3 years was during the COVID pandemic, which disrupted the lives and livelihoods of many across the globe. At the height of the pandemic, when millions of people were expected to die, vaccines were notably in surplus in Western nations. They had more than enough, yet were largely unavailable in formerly colonized nations. The global community pleaded for the knowledge on how to make effective vaccines to be made public. However, Western countries and corporations vehemently refused, demanding that the poor nations instead pay to access potentially life-saving medical treatment. Now, is this an isolated incident, or is it a candid reflection of the serious problems and the values that plague the knowledge ecosystem? Public access to scientific and scholarly knowledge still remains predominantly exclusive and undemocratic for many in the global science community, as well as for the billions whose lives are shaped by the developments in science, but cannot themselves directly participate or shape the outcomes of scientific knowledge. Only a minority of the world's population has meaningful access to knowledge that rightfully belongs in the public domain. This knowledge belongs in the public domain as it is often funded by taxpayer money. And even, for example, in the case of large internet datasets, these are also collected through the labor of the public. They too should belong to the public, as well as the advancements built from these datasets. But this is not the case. These exclusions exist in the world of science, in publishing papers, in publishing datasets, or creating tools and technology from this knowledge. And they're especially worse in formerly colonized nations. They affect these peoples in a variety of negative ways. The result is that the benefits, the potential benefits, and the risks of knowledge are not distributed equally. This inequality, I would like to argue, is more than mere chance, happenstance, or the individual fault and flaws in decision-making of those who are harmed. This is actually a colonial pattern and a prototype of oppression. Today's lack of access to knowledge, its production, dissemination, and consumption by those in science, the public, and particularly those historically colonized and enslaved, is inimical to liberty and justice just as much as illiteracy was used by white Europeans to sustain the socioeconomic power asymmetries between Europeans and those they had enslaved. If this is the case, then what governance principles, practices, procedures can we find to address yesterday's lingering inequalities that are present in modern form and still reproduce injustices and inequality? If justice, equality, and liberty are universal goals and universal rights that are enabled by knowledge, just as Frederick Douglass would argue, then the knowledge ecosystem itself must be decolonized. So how do we decolonize the knowledge ecosystem? Now, open access to knowledge can be a means towards greater inclusion within society. However, access to knowledge is part of a greater ecosystem of structures and practices that benefit human welfare and scientific progress. The entire knowledge ecosystem must be reviewed and restructured in order for it to be an effective means to bring about greater inclusion. It's not enough just to create access to knowledge. The entire ecosystem, the components, are also necessary to be examined. While access to knowledge is necessary, it is just a component to greater inclusion within society. Access to knowledge is part of the ecosystem of knowledge. And broadly, this is how knowledge is defined. What counts as knowledge? How is knowledge created? Who gets to create knowledge? And what is knowledge created for? How is it accessed? And what it is used for? These components in the knowledge ecosystem reflect human values, and they reflect societal biases. Scientific knowledge is not neutral or benevolent in as much as what is produced from it is also not automatically neutral or benevolent. Rather, the end result of knowledge depends on its use and misuses. Bacon stated that if knowledge was not being used for the benefit of all humankind, but instead was being used to exercise power over other nations, or perhaps for individual gains, it would only result in great injustices and conflict. Now, it is quite interesting that Bacon almost predicts how the advancements in knowledge within Europe, within the borders of Europe, if not made available to the world or made available to benefit the rest of the world, would inevitably result in injustices and conflict. They would easily lead to colonization. It's also quite interesting and telling that accessing knowledge does not attribute a higher moral sense. In other words, the more knowledge we have does not necessarily mean we will make moral choices, moral decisions, good choices, good decisions. This all depends on how knowledge is used. A South African philosopher reflecting on this idea, on how knowledge shapes society, he reflects that a highly ethical society is not a society that necessarily has the most technology or has the most knowledge. And equally so, a technologically advanced society does not automatically possess a high ethical level. Knowledge is not neutral. Indeed, more often than not, he writes, technological advancement tends to barbarize society, since by its very nature, it implies a high degree of competitiveness for resources. Bacon also shares that throughout history, the greatest civilizations in knowledge all apparently had the greatest armies and the greatest military campaigns. With more and more knowledge, it seems that there's often a correlation with more death and more war, with more destruction. The experiences of the past half a century, the past century, definitely demonstrate this. Knowledge and its applications are far from neutral. The knowledge ecosystem consists of a series of value of choices, therefore making knowledge itself not neutral. What should be researched? What should be considered novel and innovative enough to be published in papers? And what the requirements should be for the public to access published knowledge? And what problems to apply knowledge to? All reflect value systems and choices and biases of those who are able to participate within the knowledge ecosystem. Knowledge and value systems can never be neutral for any reason because they are used, discovered, and designed by people. They're developed by people. Values are not autonomous. They don't exercise themselves. And when people participate in the knowledge ecosystem, they bring values with them. Now, when others are excluded, then dominant values are not challenged or refined, and instead are crossed, and instead are applied globally across, imposed on others. This is a colonial pattern. This resulting knowledge then reinforces the exclusion that already exists. This specialized satellite workshop is a testament to the known evidence that the knowledge ecosystem, particularly how we access knowledge, it is not inclusive, nor democratic. In fact, a study published just 2 years ago revealed that 75% of 368 editors across a variety of 25 science and medical journals were white, and only 1.1% of the same editors identified as Black. 0.1% of the global population is estimated to have access to published papers. Most of society, most of the world is entirely excluded. Furthermore, top journals such as Nature and the Royal Society have, in many instances, published racist material and justified violence and the colonization of non-white people. The journals played a role in shaping whose humanity mattered, who deserved protection, who deserved consideration and dignity, and whose culture and knowledge systems deserved preservation and proliferation. Colonialism as an institution embodied these values. However, these values that are within colonialism, they also shape how we now experience the knowledge ecosystem. Who benefits from this knowledge ecosystem is still similar to who was benefiting from the effects of imperialism and colonization. Now, the values present in the knowledge ecosystem are reflected by who and which groups of people are valued in the ecosystem and can also derive and extract value from the knowledge ecosystem. Those who disproportionately benefit from the knowledge ecosystem and those who are excluded from it and even marginalized by it reflect the values that were in effect during colonialism, particularly in the alienation from scientific progress and knowledge production of those who were colonized. This means that colonialism effectively continues in the knowledge ecosystem, systematically disenfranchising certain groups for the benefits of others. These colonial patterns, they still exist within the knowledge ecosystem. And unless we find measures that are designed specifically to deal with these colonial legacies, we cannot improve access to knowledge, and we cannot improve the components that shape the knowledge ecosystem. Now, another barrier and a colonial pattern that is reflected in how we publish knowledge and access knowledge ecosystems are the economic barriers that prevent this access. A barrier to accessing scientific knowledge is the cost of subscription to journals. Michael Eisen, a publisher of one of the open journals out there, open access journals, he estimates that publishers are paid between around $10 billion a year to publish knowledge that is funded by the public. These costs result in less than 0.1% of the population having access to these publications. Furthermore, this problem is worsened in countries with low internet connectivity, with poor infrastructure, and the costs are compounded by having to access devices, compatible devices, internet, and the infrastructure to even access this knowledge. However, the greatest economic barrier to the world's majority being able to access published knowledge, published papers, could be the impact of colonialism itself and neo-colonialism on the world's marginalized populations. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of these barriers. The estimated effects of colonization by some economists and political activists from the majority part of the world, the global south, is quite massive and really difficult to comprehend. The Indian economist Utsa Panaik estimates that in India alone, a gross underestimate is that $64 trillion of colonial transfer left India in its way to the United Kingdom. $64 trillion of value lost in colonial transfer. This effectively impoverished the richest nation at that time. Now, within the United States, the case for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans is quite staggering. And the conservative costs estimate this to be between $12 and $13 trillion. And this is based from looking at the price and value of land promised, and also the cost of how much it was to purchase an African person as property. Now, this estimate doesn't include interest rates or the prices of wages. But when you include the interest rate, for example, 6%, this cost rises to $6.2 quadrillion. This estimate does not still take into account the lost opportunities of personal suffering and damages. One can only imagine what are the true costs if one factors the amount of resources stolen from the African continent, taken from Latin America and other parts of Asia. These resources, once they left these colonized regions, they contributed and directly funded the development of scientific research and production and the industrialization of Europe and America, while simultaneously underdeveloping the economies and livelihood of the colonized world. The externalized costs of the knowledge ecosystem and the technological advancements of the knowledge ecosystem was involuntarily paid for by the colonized world. And now their economic condition, which is a result of colonization in the first place, largely a result of colonization, is now a barrier to their access of knowledge. It is morally and totally unjust for those whose labor, resources, and bodies experimented on, funded knowledge, and for them to be then systematically excluded from accessing knowledge ecosystems or participating in them. Now, another colonial pattern within the knowledge ecosystem that worsens exclusion is this idea of rationality, or what consists of as knowledge. An aspect of colonization is determining what forms of knowledge and expertise counts. The creation of knowledge can easily create power asymmetries. It was once common, for example, that the philosophies from the African continent were viewed as mythology or religious beliefs. It was inconceivable that Africans could have philosophy and rational discourse. And someone, not African, decided that that was the case. Some institutions decided that that was the case. Institutions that did not represent the people whom they were speaking for. Now, this attitude has the potential to shape which knowledge contributions can be determined as having merit and who should participate in the gatekeeping of knowledge. Currently, we do gatekeep knowledge. The lack of diversity in the knowledge ecosystem robs the world of potential solutions that can benefit others. Not only is this system unjust, it is also opaque and undemocratic. It is often unclear who should determine what should be rational, reasonable, and important within science. Because historically, what consists of as knowledge or rationality has been knowledge designed to advance European and American imperial interests. The processes of publishing knowledge or participating effectively in its design and use are not democratic, and they have never been democratic since their establishment. Certain power asymmetries shape who has influence within the knowledge ecosystem. By effect, the questions that matter and the questions that should be investigated, these are questions that are curated and filtered by predominantly white institutions and white editors. Could this potentially affect what knowledge seems to matter, what knowledge should be paid attention to, and what problems should be solved? Inclusion is necessary in every part of the knowledge system. Now, another idea that reflects a colonial pattern within knowledge systems is the understanding that the failure to understand that access to knowledge doesn't give us moral instructions or direction. The internet is a great example of this. We can compare parallels between the internet and between how we access published knowledge that should be for public good. One of the promises of the internet was that the internet would be a force for democracy, that it would lead to global good. In fact, one author went so far as to say that by simply using the internet, people all over the world would feel a sense of freedom that was inherent within the internet. And then they would begin to demand this liberation and democracy in their own societies. It was thought, therefore, that restraints were not necessary, as the best ideas would prevail. The underlying belief being that if knowledge is just accessible, if knowledge is open, society would automatically benefit. Now, this has been far from the truth. The internet has also greatly contributed to misinformation, to disinformation, to the disruption of democracy and exacerbation of social biases. Similar arguments are being made as well that artificial intelligence and generative AI can be used to usher in a wave of social good and transformations. However, without constraints and boundaries, it is unclear if this will be ultimately a force for good as well. When knowledge is made open, are we also removing the privacy and safety of others? During colonization, numerous scientific efforts and fields were developed to better study non-whites and non-Europeans. But this was often designed to make the program of colonization more effective and much easier to implement. This pattern exists as well in artificial intelligence, and it manifests itself in the data sets, for example, from indigenous communities, indigenous people, that are often included in large language models produced by big tech. Now, the sacred knowledge of indigenous populations, the knowledge systems, the way they think, and their privacy, which is a necessity for marginalized populations, can be made accessible and open, sometimes without even, mostly at times without their consent. So the point is that access to knowledge by itself is not beneficial one way or another. There's no implicit moral goodness in having access to knowledge. There's no one destiny, one destination that comes from having access to knowledge or even participating in it. There must be a goal towards the orientation of knowledge. It must be for a specific purpose. Within the knowledge ecosystem, we find more colonial patterns. Another one is the capture of a group's intellectual labor. And then this product is then sold back to them as a finished good, a finished product. This is a colonial pattern noted by Kwame Nkrumah in his book on colonialism, also as the first president of Ghana. Journals add value to scientific papers by creating peer review processes, and they manufacture prestige, and then they sell back the end product to society as a published paper, back to the scientific community and to the public. The public pays for the funding of this knowledge, and they now have to repurchase the final product, which they already funded in the first place. Marxist economist Udna talks about this pattern in India. She describes how in India, the United Kingdom would pay for Indian goods and services through the tax money that was already collected from Indians. So merchants and innovators and the public were being paid from their own money that they were already owed. This colonial transfer of wealth was in one direction, not bidirectional. Journals are then also double charging the public when they repeat this colonial pattern to pay for what you have already paid for. Is reminiscent of these patterns of oppression. Now, this is a pattern dominant all over the knowledge economy. For example, 90% of all African art illegally resides outside the African continent. So most Africans have to purchase plane tickets, travel to Europe and America, pay for accommodation and museum entrance fees to see the art that their families and communities produced. This is because the museums also claim to be providing a service in preserving human history and artistic knowledge. just like journals and papers and publishing companies can claim to do the same. The issue also manifests itself within the field of artificial intelligence and generative AI, where the production of knowledge is captured through large language models, and then it is finished as a final good and given back to society as a service you have to pay for. Although the tech companies didn't pay to access that knowledge, which they found throughout the internet produced by the public. This means that the processes within the knowledge ecosystem must be completely decentralized and democratized. Now, what is the way forward? The good news is that this was not always the legacy of knowledge ecosystems. This was not always the legacy of Europe's involvement with the rest of the world. Scientific knowledge, according to Bacon, was meant to benefit all humankind. Francis Bacon believed that, also being the same person who had the greatest influence in the establishment of journals, believed that knowledge systems were designed to create sovereignty and to liberate people. He writes in his book that knowledge is not for pleasure of curiosity or for quiet resolution or for victory or wit or for fame, ambition, or even the enablement of business. He says that these are not the true ends of knowledge, but rather the true end of knowledge is in restitution and reinvesting in great part sovereignty and power back to humankind. The ultimate goal of the scientific revolution, as imagined by Francis Bacon, the ultimate goal of knowledge, as imagined by others such as Frederick Douglass, is to give back to those who have been disenfranchised, to those who have been disempowered, to give them back and to give humanity back sovereignty and power in ways that remove exclusion and bring equality to all. Knowledge is not about making billions of dollars, honor, or fame. But knowledge should be, the true ends of knowledge are to restore sovereignty and power to all humans. In this conference, we have a diverse gathering with humans from all walks of life. I encourage myself and all of us to explore what this means for us to restore the sovereignty of all humans through decolonizing the knowledge ecosystems. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.